Hello and welcome to the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation Meet the Scientists monthly webinar series. I'm Dr. Jeff Borenstein, BBRF's President and CEO. Today, Dr. Erin Kaufman will present Evaluating the Potential of a Sleep Intervention Among Youth at High Risk for Borderline Personality Disorder. BBRF is the world's largest private funder of mental health research grants supporting transformative discoveries in order to develop improved treatments, cures, and methods of prevention. The high quality of the research we fund is made possible by the BBRF Scientific Council. This group of over 190 prominent mental health researchers reviews each grant application and selects the most promising ideas with the greatest potential to lead to breakthroughs. The Scientific Council guides the foundation to fund creative and impactful basic, translational, and clinical research relevant to the whole spectrum of mental health. One of the reasons that research funded by BBRF has such a great impact is because we did not limit our focus to one illness or condition. Since 1987, the foundation has awarded $475 million to fund more than 6,800 research grants around the world and across a broad spectrum of brain conditions, including addiction, ADHD, anxiety, autism, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, depression, eating disorders, OCD, post-traumatic stress, schizophrenia, as well as suicide prevention. Today, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Erin Kaufman. Dr. Kaufman is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Utah and was a BBRF 2023 Young Investigator. Our webinar will begin with Dr. Kaufman's presentation and will then be followed by Q&A. To submit your questions, please use the questions tab on the control panel on your screen. Feel free to ask the questions, submit the questions at any time. Following the presentation, I'll ask as many as time allows. And now, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Kaufman. Erin, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Thank you all for being here today. I'm very excited to speak with you about some preliminary findings from an ongoing clinical trial that we have funded by the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation. And we're going to be talking about a sleep intervention among youth who are at very high risk for borderline personality disorder. I'm going to be speaking with you today about the real-time experiences with sleep training, or REST study. We tried to be on topic with our acronym. This is a clinical trial that we're running in my lab, and I put up my source of support there as the BBRF, and I have no additional financial disclosures associated to report. I want to start with a brief overview of what borderline personality disorder is and why it's a diagnosis that's particularly worth attending to among adolescents. Next, I'm going to try to convince you why sleep is a promising intervention target among this population, and also provide a bit of context as to why this might not have been sufficiently explored up to this point in time. We'll then get into the design of this particular study. I'll cover some preliminary findings with the data that we've acquired so far, and we'll finish up with some time for discussion about future directions before a Q&A period. I also recognize that many folks on this call are not psychologists or psychiatrists or scientists, and so my goal here is to kind of guide you through what this type of psychopathology can look like and what the clinical trial looks like in a pretty accessible way, and I hope I'm successful with that. So let's get started. Borderline personality disorder is a persistent and profoundly impairing mental health condition. It's characterized by patterns of instability across multiple key domains of functioning. Persons with BPD may have difficulty with stormy or chaotic interpersonal relationships, disrupted identity-related functioning, emotion dysregulation, particularly with respect to anger for a lot of folks. And they also often tend to exhibit marked difficulties with impulsivity. And those issues with impulsivity can manifest in a lot of different ways. Some may have risky drug and alcohol use. Some folks may engage in binge eating. Others demonstrate a pattern of saying hurtful things or blurting out sentences that they can kind of get them in trouble. Reckless driving would be another example that would fall under this particular criterion. And what's really important to understand with this condition is research has shown previously that even just 1 or 2 symptoms of BPD is associated with significant risk for co-occurring psychiatric conditions, but also for functional impairment. So folks that even have very few symptoms of this diagnosis, it can have a really big impact on their life. And as you might imagine, the symptoms of BPD are very painful for the person who's experiencing them, and also for those who love and support the affected individual. Although BPD affects a relatively small portion of the overall population, individuals with this condition tend to utilize both behavioral health and medical services at a very high rate. To put this in perspective, those with BPD use more services than persons with major depression, even though major depression is a much more common diagnosis. The vast majority of individuals with BPD will have multiple psychiatric hospitalizations, an average of 6 outpatient therapists, and numerous medication trials before the diagnosis offsets. And what this tells us is that even with high service utilization, even with these folks going out and asking for help from their physicians and their therapists, those with BPD rarely recover via standard community care. We also really need to think about effective suicide prevention among this population, because approximately 69 to 80% of folks with BPD engage in deliberate self-inflicted injury or bodily damage on purpose, and as many as 9% of these folks go on to die by suicide. Now that you know a little bit about what BPD can look like, you can probably understand how important it is to focus on both prevention and timely treatment. Early detection of who is at elevated risk for BPD facilitates rapid treatment delivery. It reduces individual suffering and also societal costs associated with the disorder. We really want to help provide better supports to vulnerable individuals before these symptoms become too entrenched, if at all possible, and also figure out ways to enhance treatment efforts for people who are already affected. Perhaps fortunately, the symptoms of BPD don't typically arise out of the blue all at once at thresholds that are significant enough for diagnosis. Although there are certainly many paths to BPD, there are many ways by which folks can arrive at this diagnosis. And of course, the disorder can arise at any point in time across development. Many affected people start exhibiting discernible symptoms during adolescence. That's really the time that a lot of these features become identifiable for the first time. And available studies suggest that BPD affects about 1 to 3% of adolescents in the general population, but about 11% of those presenting to outpatient clinics, and as many as 78% of suicidal adolescents presenting at the emergency department. So these, again, are teens in high need and very high risk. So we do have relatively effective treatments for borderline personality disorder. However, a recent systematic review that kind of summarizes the available evidence we have indicated that about half of individuals don't respond to psychotherapy, and that's our frontline treatment. Furthermore, a lot of existing treatments that have shown beneficial effects for some folks are often really difficult to access for people. These treatments are typically pretty expensive, they're lengthy, and they're intensive to participate in. They demand a lot both of the therapist and of the client during treatment. So for example, what many consider to be the gold standard for BPD treatment, that's called dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT. That treatment is multi-component. It lasts for typically 6 to 12 or more months in duration, and it requires a relatively high degree of training to administer adherently from the practicing clinician. This can be really tough to get youth and families to commit to, and it can also be difficult to get clinicians to commit fully to and practice really adherently, because it's quite demanding on everyone involved. And this is not to dismiss DBT. I myself am intensely trained in DBT and really love that treatment model. But I also believe that we need to identify methods for optimizing BPD treatment and prevention, and that's really an urgent public health priority at this point. Okay, so when attempting to identify promising and relatively novel areas for intervening with BPD, I began to think about the role of sleep. The more research that we have on sleep and mental health, the more foundational we've realized that sleep is to both behavioral health and physical health. We also know from prior research that disrupted sleep is closely linked to a lot of defining characteristics for BPD. So if you have difficulties with your sleep, you're more likely to be sensitive and reactive to stress. If you think about a day or a week where perhaps you've had too little sleep, or you've awoken a lot in the night, maybe you've fallen asleep too early or too late, you probably remember being pretty cranky and having a shorter bandwidth for dealing with any difficulties that arise. And perhaps you were more emotional, maybe you had slower reaction times, more difficulty inhibiting your impulses, like maybe you ate way too much pizza or too many cookies, maybe you blurt out something that you shouldn't. And if you think about how a lack of really restorative sleep might affect somebody who is already at risk for BPD, we can just assume that this will amplify a lot of what they're dealing with day to day. And if you have teenagers at home, you also probably know that most teens are chronically sleep deprived, and that can have a huge impact on their mood and their functioning day to day. Existing studies have shown that people with BPD do endorse a range of sleep difficulties. And this research has also demonstrated that sleep problems aren't better accounted for by co-occurring depression or other psychiatric diagnosis. Importantly, sleep problems can also worsen BPD symptom course and also the chronicity of the disorder. It can heighten risk for suicide and interfere with cognitive processes that are really vital to learning and behavioral intervention. For example, memory consolidation and attentional processes are both really impacted by sleep. And treatments for BPD currently place a pretty limited emphasis on sleep difficulties. For example, that DBT that I was talking to you about earlier, it weaves sleep into one part of one skill, and many, many different skills are taught. The skill essentially says, take care of yourself, get enough sleep to support you, and no more or less. And although we have approaches that are sleep focused, like cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia and the youth version of the transdiagnostic sleep and circadian intervention, or the trans-C youth intervention, we know that those are effective with a lot of different populations, but it's really unclear whether a sleep-focused intervention can be tolerated or followed adherently by youth with BPD features, who are often pretty dysregulated. In fact, while I was on internship at the Western Psychiatric Institute in Pittsburgh, they have a really strong emphasis on sleep research. And I remember speaking with some colleagues about sleep intervention and saying, don't you think that could be really helpful for youth that are at risk for BPD? And really hearing the feedback that sleep experts didn't believe that youth with BPD symptoms could follow the sleep intervention, that they thought they wouldn't necessarily benefit until they had their BPD symptoms treated first. And I think that that's, an empirical question that I really wanted to test for a lot of different reasons. Essentially, my thinking was that if we could intervene early to help with sleep regulation, it could lay a better foundation to help teens better cope with their symptoms and potentially help them get more benefit out of additional therapy if they're sleeping well and able to remember everything that they're learning in treatment. So that gives you a bit of background leading up to the clinical trial that I'm currently running. The overall objective of the REST study is to test the effects of a sleep-focused intervention among a group of adolescents who have at least 3 clinically impairing features of BPD and at least some difficulty with their sleep. They don't have to have a full-blown sleep disorder in order to qualify for the study. Especially at this point, we're really interested in seeing if this can move any difficulties with sleep, if it can benefit folks to any degree before we move into folks with full-blown insomnia or some other sleep disorder. We had 2 main aims for the project. First, we wanted to better understand how sleep quality and quantity transact with BPD symptoms in day-to-day life. So for example, if you sleep poorly, does that lead to worsening of next day symptoms? Or perhaps there's a cumulative effect where if you sleep badly, maybe later in the week, your BPD symptoms seem to flare up. We also want to know whether BPD symptoms, particularly those occurring later in the day, closer to bedtime, if those interfere with sleep. You can imagine if you have a big blow up with a friend right before bed, it can make it a lot more difficult to downregulate and be able to fall asleep. We haven't yet dived into analyzing this question yet at this point in the trial, so I'll have to leave you hanging a little bit. Sorry about that for those results, but hopefully we'll be able to publish them in the near future. The second aim of the project is to study changes that might occur in sleep and BPD symptoms after administering a single session sleep intervention. And we adapted ours from the youth version of the transdiagnostic sleep and circadian intervention, or the TRANS-C youth intervention, developed by Allison over, I believe, in San Francisco. And sleep interventions are typically much briefer than treatments that were developed to target BPD directly. They're also much more accessible because folks from a wider range of educational backgrounds can effectively administer those treatments. Honestly, I think a bachelor's trained person could do a great job under supervision delivering this type of intervention. So it makes it a lot more appealing. Okay, so we're recruiting a sample of teens between the ages of 13 and 18 for this study, and they need to have at least 3 impairing BPD symptoms, as I said earlier. We originally anticipated recruiting about 50 adolescents and their parents to participate, but now we're shooting for more like 60 dyads because early in the study we were still figuring out how to do a few aspects of data collection, and we want to make sure that we're really well powered to detect effects. We included a parent to participate with their child for a few different reasons. First, we just really value parent report of how their kid is doing. Parents often have a different perspective from their teen, and they're also typically the ones that are encouraging youth to attend treatment. And usually parents are also facilitating youth participation to some extent. That could be something as simple as driving them to session. But in this case, we also wanted to include parents in the intervention because they can help create an environment that's more supportive of their teen getting better sleep, and also potentially help their teen remember to practice what they learn if we include them in the intervention. And having parental support can go a long way. We also kind of hope that parents might learn something from the intervention that they can apply themselves and sleep better also. So teens who were interested in participating completed a brief telephone screen to determine eligibility, and we also spoke with their parent at this time. During the screening, we administer an interview-based version of a BPD instrument called the McLean screening instrument, or the MSI. If you see that on future slides, that's what that's referring to. And we also used a couple of pediatric sleep scales called the PROMIS scales. One measures sleep disturbance and the other measures impairment from poor quality sleep. Families who were eligible and willing to participate were scheduled for 2 study visits with our team. So this figure depicts the timeline for participants progressing through the study. And during visit 1, we administer some diagnostic interviews and self-report scales measuring BPD and suicidal ideation and participants' lifetime experiences with self-inflicted injury. We also administer a social problem-solving task where teens hear the beginning and end of a story that's really about a social conflict and how it resolved, and they have to create a narrative to tie the 2 parts of the story together in as much detail as possible. My graduate student, Brianna Madawi, is working with that task, and it's going to be very interesting. After this first visit, parents and teens each fill out pre-treatment measures so we can understand how they're doing at baseline before we give them any sort of intervention. These measures include scales tapping psychopathology symptoms, emotion dysregulation, depressive symptoms, sleep hygiene practices, impulsivity, and also identity functioning. So a lot of different domains that are relevant to borderline personality disorder. After visit 1, and the teens and their parent complete their survey packets, teen participants complete a 10-day, what we call ecological momentary assessment, or EMA design. And this is really assessing self-reported sleep and BPD symptoms in daily life. They're also provided a wearable sleep headband to track their sleep with. So EMA is kind of a fancy way of saying that we just collect short surveys from teens in their day-to-day life. These surveys can capture changes in mood. We ask about after effects from various interpersonal interactions. We ask teens about their self-harm urges and self-harm behaviors, and also their self-reported experiences of sleep. We administer these surveys 5 times a day. They take about 5 minutes or less to complete for most participants, and each daily survey assesses current mood, all 9 BPD symptoms, and a few other things since their last completed prompt. Okay, so now let's talk about this sleep monitoring headband. You can see it depicted there on the right side of the screen. That's my wonderful study coordinator, Jen Pernutsky, that is wearing it for you there. We have youth wear this device during the time that they complete those daily surveys so that we can get a measure of what's going on during the day at the same time that we have a more objective sleep measure at night. And really the whole purpose of sending them home with this sleep headband is so that we can have a more objective measure of both their pre-intervention and post-intervention sleep quality. The device captures brain waves that can tell us how much sleep teens are getting, what sleep stage participants are in throughout the night, and the overall kind of quality of their sleep. We have youth watch a video that we prepared that instructs them on how to wear the device and how to record with it. We've found that youth do not like wearing this. The device itself is not particularly user-friendly or sturdy, so it's taken quite a bit of finessing from our research team to both acquire high-quality data and also keep teens motivated to wear this for, days at a time. Now, if you're a sleep nerd in the audience, I'm putting some more technical information on this slide for you. But for those who aren't, I'm going to tell you what you need to know. Essentially, the device records a signal from 2 different sites on the forehead with one large electrode that's kind of sticky like a Band-Aid, so it keeps the headband in place. And once we retrieve data from a participant, we undertake several different steps to remove noise from the data and ensure that we're only capturing the EEG signal rather than what we call artifact or signal that could be due to the teen like moving around or blinking. We want to get all of that out of our data so we can feel confident that we're just looking at their sleep and the indicators of that. We use some MATLAB scripts to clean our data and also a toolbox called Dremento to aid with sleep scoring and identifying different sleep stages. Although our programs do a pretty good job identifying segments of data that are too noisy for us to use, A member of our team with EEG experience is also visually inspecting all of our night's sleep to pull out unusable sections. And here's a picture of Dr. LaForge, who's completing all of this really valuable work for us. So here's what one night of sleep data looks like after it's been processed through Drumento, that sleep scoring toolbox. You can see there's what's called a spectrogram of EEG signal at the top, and then sleep stages are indicated below that. I just wanted to give you a sense of what our data looks like when we're trying to interpret it. Okay, so after we've collected our baseline EMA and EEG data, what are teens doing before they get the intervention? We do have teens and parents complete a Zoom call where they undergo a single intervention session. So my graduate student, Brianna Madawi, has been administering a 2-hour sleep-focused intervention. During this session, participants engage in a lot of different activities from the Trans-C Youth program. All participants start with what's called a functional analysis. That's a handout that you can see on the left. And this is where we walk through their day and document key things that they do, that they think, and that they feel at different points throughout the day. Specifically at bedtime, if they wake up in the night, we want to know what they're doing, thinking, and feeling. What do they do when they wake up? And then also during the day, we're interested in what might affect their sleep and their energy levels. After we kind of complete this broader assessment, participants watch a video that we prepared that provides a lot of psychoeducation on the importance of sleep. It highlights many common pitfalls that can disrupt sleep quality. Some examples of that might be waking at inconsistent times during the week versus the weekend. It's kind of like you're giving yourself jet lag every week. Maybe exercising or eating a large meal too close to bed would be another thing that we would want them to be aware of. Looking at screens with bright lights within an hour or two of trying to fall asleep, or even just staying in bed and worrying instead of getting out of bed and trying to do something more soothing. Those are all things that can lead to disruptions in teens' sleep. And we went ahead and did this as a video-based psychoeducation session so that we can make sure we were giving everybody the exact same information. After teens and parents watch this video, Brianna goes over a handout to reiterate the highlights from the video and also engage youth in some goal setting around their sleep now that they have this information. They then revisit their functional analysis and they fill in additional behaviors that might be relevant to their sleep. And of course, teen and parent have learned something from the video, and so they might be able to identify additional things that could disrupt or facilitate a good night's sleep for them. Next, participants articulate some sleep goals, and they also set specific actionable plans that they can enact both during the day and also at night for the next several weeks. We really try to make these goals feasible for participants. We don't want to make them too ambitious or incompatible with their lifestyle. Teens like to set really lofty goals that are very challenging to achieve, and so we try to help them break it down into smaller, actionable steps that they can take. A good goal might be to turn off their phone by 9 p.m. each night, or to avoid napping during the day so that they have a greater appetite for sleep at night. After those goals are set with each teen, and of course that looks different for everyone, we create a checklist for what they will do when they wake up in the morning. This is called a rise up routine that they can practice for weeks before we reassess them. They can engage in these activities that you can see here on the morning checklist handout, and that tends to make folks feel more alert, more awake in the morning, and have more energy throughout the day. We also create a complimentary wind down routine for participants to practice in the evening in the few hours before bed. And based on their newfound knowledge of what facilitates sleep, they can identify different activities that'll help them relax and prepare them for bed, and also identify some things to avoid, like screen time. Finally, families go over a summary handout on how to set themselves up well for high quality sleep. For example, you can see here that we encourage youth to try not to do anything in their bed but sleep, so that their bed is really associated with the sleep response. We try to have them watch TV or do homework in another space so that their brain can really associate bed with rest and rest only. We try to engage the parent and teen often throughout the entire intervention session to get them generating ideas and also telling us what's unlikely to work for them. We certainly don't want to prescribe something that is not feasible or doable given the teen and family's specific situation. So for example, if teen is actually in a studio apartment with parent, it's probably not super helpful to say, hey, don't do anything in your bed but sleep. That's probably not reasonable for that particular family setup. And so instead we might generate alternatives of where they could do their homework, maybe outside the studio apartment. And given the teen's unique routine and environment, we really try to come up with specific strategies for them to use that are really tailored. Okay. So youth then go home and they practice their new routine for approximately 3 weeks before they repeat those 10 days of 5 times a day surveys and rewear their EEG monitoring headband for us. And at the end of that period, they also fill out another round of surveys to let us know how they're doing. We can look at pre to post intervention changes on that. And this second round of EMA questions also includes items about sleep hygiene, where we ask them about how much they're actually practicing the skills that they learned in their intervention session. They also complete another battery of surveys 1 month after they finish the main portion of the study so that we can see if they maintain any beneficial effects from the intervention. Okay. So we're still in the midst of data collection, but I wanted to provide you with some preliminary results today. In terms of our sample, we are recruiting from Salt Lake City, Utah, which is a pretty white area of the country, but we are getting some span of representation across diverse gender, racial, and ethnic groups here, which is encouraging. Okay, so you can see here that the youth in our study are endorsing around 5 BPD symptoms of sufficient severity to meet clinical threshold. We have a standard deviation of over 2 points on one of our measures of BPD severity and just under 2 on the McLean. So a good number of our youth are presenting with more symptoms, but none were enrolled with fewer than 3. And I just to make folks aware, you need 5 out of 9 symptoms in order to be diagnosed with BPD. So we do have a quite clinically impaired sample overall, especially for adolescents. In the table on the right, you can see that we're also doing a pretty good job recruiting a sample with a substantial history of both non-suicidal and suicidal self-inflicted injury. So for folks who may not know, non-suicidal self-injury is deliberate harm to the body that is caused with 0 intent to die by the teen. And any level of suicidal ideation at all kind of bumps up that deliberate self-harm to more like a suicide attempt. So this is just another way to kind of visualize, or if you're a visual person, you can kind of see how our symptoms and our sample are endorsed across people. In that upper left quadrant that's light blue, you can see that many youth are endorsing 5 or more criteria in our sample, meaning that they would, again, pass that threshold for a full-blown BPD diagnosis. Let's first talk about what we're seeing with participants' survey results. So this is those 3 different times throughout the study that we give them a larger battery of questionnaires. Teens' own perception of both their disturbances or problems with sleep and also the impairments resulting from poor sleep, both of those improved from pre to post intervention. Sleep disturbances kind of gets at things like having difficulty falling asleep, staying asleep, tossing and turning throughout the night, whereas sleep impairment captures experiences like feeling sleepy throughout the day, having difficulty focusing due to fatigue, things like that. We also see that teens are reporting that their sleep hygiene improved. And sleep hygiene kind of gets at like a set of practices and habits that promote quality sleep. So we want to see improvement on that. Finally, it's really worth noting that parents' impression of their teens' difficulties with sleep are improving as well. And this is pretty exciting because we don't often see parent and youth agree on things. It seems that the impact of the sleep intervention is strong enough that parents are able to see it too, which is really great. And for the 18 kids who have also completed their 1-month follow-up surveys at the time that we were preparing this presentation, we do see a continuation of this pattern. Though the continued improvement isn't currently statistically significant. This could be because the sample is so small. Overall, it seems like families enrolled in the study are seeing benefits from the intervention, which is extremely encouraging. If you like figures, here's what the scores look like plotted out for you. You can see that the sleep disturbances scores are decreasing for both parent and youth in the upper part of the slide. Sleep hygiene is increasing in that bright green section there. And then sleep impairment is generally decreasing for both parent and teen report. Okay, so what about other domains on our surveys? Well, we're seeing that scores indexing teens' self-reported emotion dysregulation, BPD symptoms, impulsivity, and suicidal ideation, they're all moving in the direction that we would hope to see post-intervention. They're all becoming less severe. However, these changes aren't currently large enough to rule out that they could be due to chance. They're not statistically significant at this point. With only 22 teens included in the pre to post analysis right now, that's not super surprising. We'll see what happens when we have the full sample recruited. And as a reminder, we're already seeing improvements in sleep, which is the main target of the intervention, even with very few teens data collected so far. So we're hoping we're going to see more spillover or carryover effects to these other domains. We also wanted to look at whether folks with enough symptoms for a BPD diagnosis were more or less likely to benefit from the sleep intervention compared to teens with fewer symptoms. And remember that my sleep expert colleagues indicated they were really concerned about dysregulated youth being able to follow and stick to the intervention. And as it turns out, youth who meet criteria for diagnosis actually benefited more from the intervention. This group showed a 56% greater improvement, though both groups benefited from the intervention. And this indicates that youth with more severe BPD symptoms may have greater room for improvement. They might be more motivated to engage with the intervention or have better family support. Regardless, we don't totally know why yet, but it's very encouraging that even and especially those with more severe symptoms can participate in and benefit from this intervention. Okay, so what about our 5-a-day surveys, our EMA data? You can see here that even though we have relatively few participants that have made it all the way through the study at this point, we do have a lot of different assessment time points, a lot of different observations from these teens. The kind of quick summary of this is that we don't see significant differences on scores from pre to post in most domains yet. That self-injurious thoughts domain seems to be really headed in a great direction, and the p-value is like pretty close to 0.05, but not quite. So you know, we think that we might continue to see more promise as we recruit more people. However, we did want to better assess emotional lability because we really thought that might shift if you had better regulated sleep. And what that means is we're wanting to look at the variability in negative emotional states across both the pre-intervention EMA period and compare that to the post-intervention period. So we calculated the average magnitude of change between negative affective and positive affective states on consecutive surveys for these teens. Essentially, we're asking how much is your sadness, your anxiety, your shame, hopelessness, and anger shifting in intensity from one survey to the next. And we found that negative affect variability significantly decreased from pre-intervention EMA to post-intervention. In fact, we saw a 49% reduction in negative affective changes between surveys throughout the day. We also found that negative and positive affect scores were each more strongly kind of correlated or associated across surveys during the post-intervention period. And this result suggests that teens' experiences of daily negative and positive affect is becoming more predictable in that post-intervention phase of the study. So more predictability across assessment points and possibly more stable across consecutive assessments. So you can see here on the left that when we looked at volatility, that's improving at a significant level from the pre-intervention EMA period to the post-intervention period, and that we see greater predictability on the right from the pre-intervention to post-intervention assessment time point. So if you can visualize, a straight line across a graph and then one that has lots of ups and downs, those two lines might have the same average, but they look really different in terms of what the person's experience is like day to day. And the more predictable your emotions are, hypothetically, the better able you are to really respond to your environment appropriately, and you might feel less kind of jerked around by your emotions. So here we can see individual changes in emotional ability. If you look at all those little gray dots, those are individual assessment points, and we can see that its emotional ability is going down for negative affect from the pre-intervention to the post-intervention period. This graph is depicting negative affect, and the blue line is the pre-intervention period, and the red is the post-intervention period. And essentially, if you look at any one time point, any one assessment during the post-intervention period, it's more strongly correlated with a different assessment during that same period. And so again, that kind of indicates that things are getting more stable with respect to kids' experience of their negative affective states, which we hope is beneficial to them. Let's now talk about our EEG findings. So this is the findings from kids wearing those headbands for repeated days. Really, our EEG results are complementing those that we found with self-report, which is exciting. We can see that many indicators of sleep quality are improving in these preliminary analyses. For example, for youth who entered the study with the goal of getting more sleep, we see an increase of 43.4% in their sleep during their post-intervention phase. So they're getting a lot more sleep, we assume as a result from our intervention. These teens also demonstrate a 16.8% improvement in their sleep efficiency, which is the time that they're spending in bed actually being asleep as opposed to like lying awake. We find similar results when we also include youth who wanted to shift their sleep schedule so that they're better able to go to sleep and arise at certain times. Again, here we see a 7.8% improvement in their sleep efficiency and a 12.8% increase in the amount of time that they're sleeping. So even if their goal wasn't to get more sleep, they are getting more sleep and better quality sleep in the post-intervention stage. We also see a 24% reduction of waking after falling asleep initially. So this is like middle of the night waking. All right, so I've thrown a ton of results at you. I hope they were easy enough to understand, but I kind of want to sum things up a little bit. Our initial results are pretty promising for sleep improvements. And I want to remind you that this was a single session intervention with teens that are like, struggling pretty hard and a parent. Only 2 hours of time committed on the part of our therapist. And we're already seeing some really promising results. The type of intervention that we've drawn our session from is typically administered in more like 6 sessions that are an hour long each. And so we're pretty excited to see that this is helpful even when it's a single session and only 2 hours. It is possible that we might see better results with more sessions where we could check back in with teen and maybe troubleshoot any different difficulties they're experiencing. We could see even more bang for our buck if we made this a little bit longer in duration. We're not sure. As far as trickle-down effects that we're hoping to see, where sleep might also have some improvement on BPD symptoms, that's not as clear at this stage. And my guess is because we don't have enough data yet. We hope to, have about 40 more kids included in these analyses by the time we're making any conclusions. It could also be that we didn't let teens practice for long enough to really see those longer term benefits. They're only practicing for around 3 weeks before we reassess them for another 10 days. So perhaps some teens would benefit from a longer practice period. It could also just be that the sleep intervention isn't powerful enough to have trickle-down effects to BPD symptoms. That could absolutely be true, and I'm hopeful that we can get better insight if that's the case with our full sample collected. It is very promising that we're seeing greater consistency in mood throughout the 2 EMA periods. That kind of indicates that we're headed in the right direction. I wanted also to speak a little bit about where I see this program of research going, depending on the outcomes of this study. Of course, we want to examine one of our 2 main aims, which is how BPD symptoms that show up during the day impact sleep at night and vice versa. I think that will be extremely helpful for understanding the degree to which sleep can impact symptoms day to day. We also have a pie in the sky hope to run a much larger clinical trial where we would be able to examine a longer term sleep intervention, maybe the traditional 6 weeks of the trans-C youth treatment versus a standard treatment for BPD. So potentially comparing a sleep intervention to DBT alone and also comparing the combination of the 2. I have hypotheses that if we front-loaded a focus on sleep, that some teens would really benefit at a much greater level from going through DBT if they were better regulated physiologically before heading into that more intensive and expensive treatment. And if that proves to be true, it's really low-hanging fruit to target sleep. It's a really great intervention, very effective, and very easy to administer. So this could be a really impactful discovery if we do find that both the sleep intervention is tolerated and it helps people get more out of a standard BPD treatment. That would be really exciting. Maybe be able to help a lot more youth who are on a risky trajectory. I also would be interested to see if this bears out with adults who already have the diagnosis. Does this help them recover if we focus on sleep for adults as well? Thank you so much for listening to me blather on for a good amount of your day. I want to thank our participants. They are going through a tremendous number of tasks for our benefit to be able to learn if this is helpful. Very, very grateful to those families. And I also just want to acknowledge all the participants in my lab that make this happen, that are doing headband pickup and drop-offs and monitoring kids' EMA responses. And there's a photo there on the left of our lab group. I'm in the center, and they're a great group of folks. So very appreciative of them. And thank you, of course, to Brain and Behavior Research Foundation, literally without whom this would not be possible.
Well, Erin, I want to say thank you for an outstanding presentation. Really, you went through a lot of information in a very user-friendly way for lay people to understand. So thank you for that. And you spoke a little bit about the rationale about doing an intervention related to sleep, and I'm just curious, how did you think of that? What brought on this focus on sleep from your perspective as a clinician and a researcher?
That's a great question. I I worked with a DBT framework for about 5 years before I had this idea. And I love DBT. I think it's a wonderful intervention for so many people. And I just realized that a couple of the skills that have very foundational they focus on very foundational areas of wellness are quite brief. They don't place like a whole lot of emphasis necessarily on diet or exercise or sleep. And sleep just seemed to me to be an area that if it's not regulated well, man, your days are pretty hard. Mood is more difficult to regulate, and you're probably snappier with the people around you, more likely to be irritable and frustrated, and just have more difficulty, like a significant amount more difficulty navigating day to day. And then I thought about, this period of adolescence and how most teens are staying up way later on the weekends than they are during the week. And, there's been a lot of research showing how damaging that can be. And so I thought, well, what if we could get them to sleep better, and then everything else would be so much easier. But when I spoke to true experts in sleep intervention, so many expressed what I think are reasonable concerns about, well, maybe that's not the direction we need to go, because if we give them a bunch of tasks to follow and their lives are really difficult and chaotic, that could be too much for them to handle. And frankly, I just thought, I think we can give families more credit than this. I think we could target this, and we could see if it's helpful. And so really it almost seemed like just a low-hanging fruit area that, if you've ever done an insomnia intervention for somebody where that's their primary problem, it's kind of like magic. It works very well to help them regulate their sleep, and they feel much more human. They can engage with people so much more easily and meaningfully. And so it just seemed like a Venn diagram of things that could really work out to help kids that are at risk. And my thinking too is that if you target folks that are earlier in their development, they can maybe build a better foundation of regulation and carry that with them. If we can get them better regulated early, then that might help them navigate, periods of storm and stress that are natural to adolescence.
I think that's a very good point, and it sort of brings up my next question, which is, in your study, you have a number of people who have that 5 criteria for the diagnosis, but a number of people who don't have that many criteria. And I want to sort of get a better understanding of your thinking about that early intervention before somebody may have a borderline personality disorder diagnosis, but who have significant symptoms that may be bothering them. What's your take on sort of the approach of that early intervention, even before people meet the criteria?
Yeah, I think that's so important because, one, we do have a lot of evidence that even if you have 1 or 2 symptoms, it's still making your life really difficult. But also, when we think about, prodromal symptoms, that might emerge early, it would be kind of a pity to just leave that information on the table and not treat it as though it's something worthwhile to intervene on. If you wait until the point in development that somebody meets all 5 criteria, they've probably been pretty dysregulated for some time, and maybe we've missed earlier opportunities to help and get them on a different trajectory. Certainly, some people have onset of numerous symptoms very rapidly, but that isn't traditionally the case. And even our diagnostic system sort of requires that you have to have a year of symptoms to be diagnosed, and that seems like a year too long before we would want to intervene, in my book.
Yeah, if somebody was coughing and having a fever for a year before we could say they have pneumonia, that that wouldn't make sense either.
No.
I want to talk about the important issue of suicide prevention and self-harm prevention as well, because you brought up both aspects. Could you talk a little bit about what your findings with this and what you hope to find as the numbers and the research continues?
Yeah, absolutely. So we know that self-inflicted injury tends to emerge before a full-blown BPD diagnosis does. So it's one of those early symptoms that emerges for a lot of folks, sometimes as early as 12, 13 years old. And we know that, it can become a really entrenched behavior. And even for folks that aren't suicidal, they don't intend to die by those behaviors. It's an inherently distressing experience to be affected by that, and something that we really want to help youth with, really make sure that we're targeting. We have found with this data set, my graduate student, Brianna, has done some analyses looking at suicidal ideation in this sample. And we find that certain symptoms of borderline personality disorder seem to do an okay job predicting next day suicidal ideation. And one of those symptoms is difficulties with identity related problems. So when teens endorse that they are having a lot of difficulty feeling confident in who they are or knowing who they are, that tends to predict next day suicidal ideation. And so part of what we're hoping to uncover with this study is kind of how all these different symptoms transact with one another. And we do have some prior research from other scientists that show that sleep disruption is really closely tied to suicidal ideation, that folks tend to have more suicidal ideation at night, that bedtime rumination can increase risk of suicidal thinking during that time of day, and disrupted sleep among other populations that are at high risk for suicide is associated with those sorts of behaviors. So we really focus on regulating sleep with bipolar disorder and with schizophrenia, in part because disruptions to sleep, not sleeping enough, tend to predict suicidal ideation and behaviors at an elevated rate. So our hope is that if we can get teens sleeping a bit better, we will see some reductions in suicidal thinking, and we have a result that's trending in that direction already.
Wonderful. One last question. If somebody's listening to the webinar,
yes,
and either they themselves or their loved one has some symptoms or full symptoms of BPD, and they say, "Wow, son of a gun, this sounds like this could be helpful to me."
yes.
They don't live within close enough to you to be a part of the study. What should they do?
I would recommend talking to whoever your care provider is. If you have a therapist, if you have a social worker, if you have a primary care physician, or even an urgent care physician that you can speak to about disruptions with sleep and difficulties with sleep. Sleep interventions are kind of magical. They work really well for a lot of folks. And like I said, part of the appeal here is that so many folks are trained in how to do a great sleep intervention. And there are so many models of treatment that are really helpful. And so I would encourage anybody who thinks, man, this could be helpful for me, to reach out to whoever their provider is. It doesn't even have to be a long-term provider. My hope is that they can connect you to a sleep-focused program, maybe even self-guided, that could provide you at least some basic information about sleep hygiene and how to get your sleep better regulated.
Excellent advice. Erin, I want to thank you so very, very much for the extraordinary work that you're doing. We're going to have you come back and give us the full results and what happens next. But this was really just outstanding. So thank you so very, very much.
Really appreciate it. Thank you.
I also want to thank our audience for joining us today and ask people to consider making a donation to BBRF. 100% of every dollar donated for research is invested in our research grants. We're able to do this because our operating expenses are covered by separate foundation grants. This means that when you donate $1 for research, that dollar goes directly to the scientist. To make a gift, please visit bbrfoundation.org or call 1-800-829-8289. This webinar has been recorded. If you missed any portion of the presentation or would like to share it, please visit the events and webinar page on our website. And please join us again on December 9th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, when Dr. Heather M. Joseph, an assistant professor of psychiatry and pediatrics at the University of Pittsburgh, will present What Can Light Show Us About Brain Activity, examining early neural and behavioral predictors of childhood ADHD. Thank you, and remember, together we can dramatically improve the lives of those living with mental illness and enable more people to live full, happy, and productive lives. Take care.